Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to the second episode of Youth Group. We're doing a 3-part series on purity culture. Today, we are met again with Melodie Rochman, and we have a new guest, Christina Cannon. Christina, do you want to kick it off and tell us your name, qualifications, and then define purity culture?
Why do you deserve to be here?
Do I deserve to be here? Ooh,
Why did Alex call you?
Have I been summoned?
You called and you answered.
So I'm Christina Cannon. I graduated from Southern Adventist University last year. Qualifications, I suppose, are having grown up in kind of broader evangelical culture as a Seventh-day Adventist growing up. So that's kind of been an interesting thing to reflect on over the last couple of years, especially like going through Southern, like being in a very Adventist place for the first time and looking back on my time like growing up in evangelical Christianity, like, wow, these are kind of different, like kind of the same in some ways and kind of different in some others. So qualifications, is that the last question?
Define purity culture.
Oh, define purity culture. So purity culture is this idea, especially kind of coming out of like mainstream evangelical culture in America in particular, that there's a kind of two very different roles for, let's see, there are very specific gender roles, and also a woman's job in life is kind of to keep herself pure until marriage, and like pure, I guess, being no sex essentially. And then this is kind of important for men, but in different ways and not quite the same ways, which I think we'll probably talk about. So that's essentially it, is that like your job as a woman is to stay pure, i.e. having not had sex until marriage.
I love how this concept just like came out of nowhere. Like 2010-ish, I just remember like everything blew up as far as everyone was talking about purity culture. Before that, I don't remember anyone in the church really focusing on it, at least in my little corner of Adventism.
Well, also, you were 8, so...
Listen, first you thought I was too old, and now you think I'm too young.
I age shamed
That TikTok meme, that thing that's like, I can go into heavy detail, and I will go into heavy detail. Like, oh, we're going to take it a lot farther back than 2010 today.
Yes, exactly.
On the History Channel.
So do that. Where did it come from?
Melodie, do you want to define purity culture?
To me, I would just say, like, completely 100% what you said, correct. And I would say, like, purity culture is a loosely connected collection of, like, theology, culture, educational programming, all of this stuff that is, like, basically about power and control and teaching Christians, and they only ever say men and women, how to be good men and women. And like it's all about surveilling people and seeing whether they're a good person or not based on what they do with their body. That's what I would add.
So it's accurate.
Oof.
Do you have anything to add, Ari?
No big.
Shallow topic.
I don't know. In my childhood, most of purity culture was broken down into what to wear and what not to wear. That was really the big thing that was hammered for my culture was my parents were heavily involved in a hyper-conservative branch of Adventism called Restoration International, and I will drop that name because I have no shame. It was the whole jean skirts down to your ankles, hiking boots, long-sleeve t-shirts, that kind of thing, and we would go to these just family camp meetings is what they were called, where it's camp meeting, but everybody does everything together. And so it's this idea of if you have any skin showing, you're a whore. And so that was kind of my background of it. My definition was you hide your body. And that's the foundation of purity culture. And then also the kind of commitment to your future spouse was a weird thing that was hammered into me. Was, being 10, 12 years old and getting this chain with a key on it, and this is the key to your heart, and you're going to give this to the person that you marry on your wedding day, and this is
because it can't be a ring because of Adventist
exactly,
jewelry.
Exactly.
I had a purity brooch.
A purity watch.
Not Adventist dropping like $10,000 on a watch because it's not a ring.
Modesty. This Rolex is because I'm better than you, and your earrings from Claire's.
Yeah. And so it was just the very outward performance that was purity culture for me growing up.
I definitely got a lot of that too, and like saw a lot of that, and also kind of like you mentioned, like the idea of bodies are bad, kind of like I don't know if this is accurate, but I got the feeling kind of going to evangelical schools that like most of the focus was on sort of women and what women were supposed to do, whereas like the messages I got in say like Sabbath school or other like Adventist circles where say in Sabbath school I remember that thought experiment kind of where like they passed around a rose and each person like took off a petal of the rose, and like at the end like the takeaway message is, you know, who would want this kind of metaphor for a person who's been like, I guess, either dated a lot of people or had sex with a lot of people.
Or the chewed gum. That was another one.
The chewed gum.
That was
Yes.
mine,
The licked lollipop.
Yep, exactly. So like, I don't know. I kind of, for some reason, and like, I'm curious what your guys' experiences with this are. If in Adventism you got the idea that like it was more women's bodies were bad, or just all bodies are bad, all sex is bad.
It was definitely just like my body is bad. Like I had a lot of shame just in myself, and it was not rooted just like in purity culture, but just like fat phobia in general. And it wasn't even just my Adventist relatives. It was conservative relatives that were Catholic too. Like it's definitely a broad experience. I feel like that isn't solely Adventist or evangelical. It comes from like that traditional mindset. But oh my gosh, yeah, it was just like I learned to hate myself.
I wrote an essay for Spectrum a while back about going to see the Barbie movie. And when I was a kid, like, it's so weird because, like, I inherited some of that modesty culture, but I think I also inherited from my mom a kind of, like, not like other girls attitude of, like, oh, it's better to be smart than pretty kind of thing. And so, like, I remember because, like, I wanted Barbies so bad, like, because they were beautiful and they had the best clothes. My mom was, like, trying to keep me away from Barbies as long as she could, both because, like, of the feminist side of it, that she wouldn't call herself a feminist, but, like, the kind of, like, oh, unrealistic expectations for women, but also because of the, like, well, they're kind of sexy and they have the long legs and the lips and the hair and everything. And I was just, like, so in love with Barbie's
Brat
clothes.
stalls.
Oh,
like
I'm
Oh my
pre-Brat
God, the Brat
stalls,
stalls.
dude.
Trashy.
Brat stalls did not exist when I was a
No,
little
literally,
kid.
my mother called Bratz dolls trashy to my face one time
Yeah.
because I was playing with my friends, and she was like, "No, those are trashy people, and we don't want to be associated with that idea of people."
And it's like, why are they trashy?
Yeah.
Because they wear jewel tones and have big lips. Like, what inherently about them is trashy?
But I think like all of these ideas are reflecting this kind of this idea of that, like, so much more that so than for men, you can tell the content of a woman's character and her relationship to God and her intelligence and all these things based on how much makeup she's wearing or what she's dressed in or whatever. Right. I think like my mom wanted me to be able to do all these things and like aspire a lot. She wanted me to like get an education, and like she cared about the content of my mind and my character, which is not a bad thing. But I think I was raised on a dichotomy that you couldn't like makeup and like glitter and all those things and also be intelligent. Like it's like I had to distance myself from a certain kind of femininity while also needing to conform to a godly form of femininity. It's an impossible paradox, right?
I love that a good dark lip just means a woman's stupid. Like
I would say that
Like liking makeup and that type of like. Just
I love that
girly
you mentioned the dark lip because it feels like in the same way there's that chart of like skirt length, like it like
how
bright
red
lip.
and how dark.
If it's like I wear a really dark lip on purpose because I want to seem like one of those poisonous animals, like to dudes, I'm like, do not. Like, if you are intimidated by this,
is my lipstick laced? You'll never know.
I love like the femme fatale with the like the lipstick that like is poison.
I think I just kind of grew up like a little misogynist because of that mentality of like, if I like girly things, like I genuinely did not like women to a certain extent. Like I didn't like being a girl for the longest time. Like obviously I was attracted to them, but I like hated them at the same time.
I love that mental image of just little 6-year-old Sofia running around making misogynistic
I was
comments.
I was a little monster. The little 6-year-old stories I have of myself, I was evil.
I definitely felt that dichotomy too. Like you can either be smart or pretty, which like I don't know. I'm trying to think if there's like anything in particular that enforced that, and I don't remember anything really. But yeah,
I think like there was this TikTok I saw recently that was so healing for me because it was talking about how like. First, there was the I'm not like other girls phase, and there was the backlash against that. And now it's like, I'm exactly like other girls. Like, I love Pink. I love Barbie. Like, I love Taylor Swift. Like, I'm happy about that. But, like, so much of that came not from a place of, like, hating other women, but because we would see all these stereotypes about girls, and we would be like, well, I have a rich interior life. Like, I'm thoughtful. I care about things. And so, like, I guess I'm not like that if that's what other women are like, because patriarchy was telling us, like, oh, girls only care about getting married and having a baby and whatever. Girls don't care about their careers. careers. Girls aren't curious. Girls don't do STEM or whatever. Like,
It's like 1950s idea of women.
which is so constructed and ahistorical.
Yeah. So after you age shamed me about my 2010 thing, where did it actually come from? Like, how did this become such a massive American ideology that millions subscribe to when it really has no logical foundation whatsoever?
Well, you're the history major. Do you want to start us off?
So I guess, well, it goes back a little farther than, what did we say, 2008, 2010? I think, slightly.
Listen, that's when I noticed that it was
The
popping
roots are
off.
a little deeper
That's
than
when
that.
the Jonas Brothers came out with
Exactly.
their purity ring.
I think that's when they took them off.
I mean, I guess like the next, I think probably the first like very recent iteration of it, and I know like maybe you can talk about a little bit about how it goes back way farther than that, but it kind of like the term purity culture I think kind of came to use in the 90s. There's like, different groups floating around like True Love Waits, and a number of books coming out also into the early 2000s, like Harris's I Kissed Dating Goodbye, or you mentioned Dateable, I think. And so there's all this like media surrounding the idea of, well, yeah, True Love Waits, I guess, was kind of the central thesis of, if anything you do, that's like kind of anything you do outside of marriage, like even dating someone is kind of training yourself to cheat on them, is kind of the idea I also got a little bit of. Like, yeah, anything you do, physical contact or like even emotional closeness is just kind of taking away from the satisfaction and fulfillment you'll have later in life. So I think 90s was probably the first time that came to be. And I think Adventism, I'm curious, I bet it was a little bit isolated from this at the beginning, maybe. And then probably as the internet kind of came to be in wider use and people could like say, Google an object lesson to use in Sabbath school, like Wind Up with the Rose or something like that. Then it kind of seeped in. And we also weren't kind of reading as much, probably the bigger, more popular evangelical authors like LaHaye's and Dobson.
Really quick to jump in, dating somebody is like cheating on your future spouse. Even emotional intimacy was a big one.
That's
growing
Joshua
up.
Harris.
And that comes, exactly. My parents were huge I Kissed Dating Goodbye fans. And the idea that like you can't even be close emotional friends with someone that you could potentially have a crush on. Like my parents made me break off my best friendship in high school because they thought that I had a crush on this girl. And like that just isolation is really weird. But yeah, goes past the physical intimacy side of it.
Exactly, which is such an interesting idea, I guess. I don't know. But do you want to talk about how like I said, it came to be kind of more popular in the 90s. But like, yeah, where did it come from before that?
Right. So I think that like this kind of 90s iteration is the one we think about because it's this moment where we get these like books and we get the language and like that language is still the language that we think about. Like, we are not here to give you an entire history of like the church and sex. There are some
want that history.
Well, if you do,
honest.
Yeah, that's
book
what we're here for.
Time. So there are two fantastic books that I would totally recommend checking out. One is Shameless by Nadia Bolz-Weber, where she kind of looks at like this very large scale like history of the development of traditional Christian sexual ethics and like what might it look like to develop a progressive Christian ethic of sexuality that is still distinctly Christian, but is not this kind of one that we've inherited that's been so toxic and damaging. The other book I would super recommend is by a scholar named Sarah Mosliner. It's called Virgin Nation. So basically, like there's no one story of history, right? Like you can start here or you can start there, but there's always going to be backstory to the story. Wherever you start, you're going to have to go back farther. Like we can start with Augustine getting a boner at the public baths in Rome and then being so embarrassed about it that he like changes church theology forever. Is that
historical?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Okay, so St. Augustine. So St. Augustine, the father of memoir, who wrote the Confessions, like the first memoir really, and definitely like the big spiritual memoir we look to. He went to the public baths as a teenager and he got a public boner and he was really embarrassed about it. And we know this because he wrote it down. And he developed a theology of the fall. And one of his theologies of the fall was that in the Garden of Eden, Adam could control when and where he got a boner.
No.
Whereas after the Garden of Eden, he couldn't. So like that's part of it. Like
I've seen some really embarrassing public boner situations, but never like
oh my
forever
God.
altering.
I'm not going to name drop, but there was a guy in my class where it would happen like in choir class. Like for some reason,
choir class.
You're like, I'm not going to name drop,
this
but
man
hey,
would pop a boner every single morning. And it wasn't like it's called a non-apparent reason boner. A narp. That's what they're called. Yeah. So like that's
So like
crazy.
him and Augustine, that meme with like the fist clasping, like finding a theological
promise
reason
you, this
to
man
not
is
get a
not
boner.
Augustine.
So like
You didn't go to high school with Augustine?
like Nadia Bolz-Weber, right? Is like Augustine is one of the reasons that we have this anxiety around sexuality.
Interesting.
And then like I know we have been talking about how another one of those big tent post kind of moments where stuff shifts is kind of with the Reformation, which changes so much. And there's this book.
Don't tell me
What's
Luther
the
got a
author?
public boner too.
Oh no! I mean, Luther left being a monk to marry a nun, which is very cash money of him. The anti-Semitism less so. What's the book we were talking
Let's
about?
see, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. That
Yeah.
one. Okay.
By
Christine Cabez.
no, this one's
Beth Allison Barr.
They are friends, and they always
Okay.
appear. Beth
Yes.
Allison Barr is a historian who wrote this book, the
excellent.
making of biblical womanhood, about this idea that like biblical womanhood is people act like it's this thing that's always existed, but it's actually been constructed. And remind me, like, what is it that she says about that transition from the Middle Ages and their view of women to like the Reformation?
I know she talks about like when we reference the verses of Paul like today, talking about like women's silence in the church. Like that was not really a thing anyone emphasized in the Middle Ages, if I'm correct. And also there was like women had a good degree of agency, or at least more than we like to think they did. Like life as a nun kind of afforded them the ability to travel or like speak publicly. There are a number of like of women preachers, essentially, I guess. I don't think ordination was a thing for them
But they were still
at that time. But they were like,
spiritual
They had power.
influences.
Yes,
Yeah.
very
like Hildegard von
well-known.
Bingen
Exactly.
is like a
it's huge
total
figure.
awesome person, like the mother of German botany, like spoke tons of
Then, like,
languages. But then the nunneries close, and women only have the option to be wives and mothers.
Right, which is interesting because we think of like, I don't know, if we have this kind of hierarchical view of like Protestantism like evolving and going beyond like Middle Age Catholicism, that was not really how it worked for women.
I mean, even the Episcopal Church was founded specifically to have control over women
The
because
Episcopal
of
Church or the Anglican Church?
Sorry, yes, thank you. Just so that he could divorce someone, like
I
an
think
entire branch of
I feel
I
like
love
that's something
that.
I would do if I was a man.
100%.
in power back then. Like that's so
guess.
Sophia coded. in
it's
my
like on a
brain.
level
Like, I
of
would do
1
that.
to like let the entire church through a theological schism just to leave you. How bad was your breakup?
Exactly.
It's up there.
I was trying to think though, like even before all of that, like the genesis of like keep your pants on or keep your robes on type of mentality. And I was like thinking, it makes sense really, really far back, right? Because back in the Stone Age era, they were like, oh, if you had a consequence physically, that means that you like did something wrong and God is punishing you, right? So they probably thought like, oh, I have like this disease which is like probably gonorrhea or something, right? And they're like, oh, it's directed to that. God's mad at me, therefore like I should only have sex with one person. So like how did it get from like that very formula like ideal into what it is now, where it's like this deep-rooted shame? Like I want to know
Yeah.
how take it all the way back.
Okay, so like
Please.
I think that like I want to resist the idea that there's one unified narrative of history. Like that is not true. Like history is a collection of stuff that happened and we tell stories about it, right? And one story that I think is interesting and helpful is thinking about the relationship between race, virtue, and property. So a lot of, like we were talking about the Renaissance and like Henry VIII and stuff like that. In that kind of court, the king could have as many mistresses as he want. They lived in court. They had their own houses. Everyone knew this was happening. He's fathering tons of kids, but the queen must not have sex with anyone else. And that's because we need to be able to guarantee that the queen's babies are the king's and that whoever she gives birth to is going to inherit, right? So like for a long time in history, the people who had to care the most about sexual purity were people who had property. Like if you don't have property to inherit, it doesn't matter as much like who your children are going to be.
I feel like it's a pretty justifiable reason for purity culture if your child gets to become king.
Yeah, like it makes sense on a pragmatic level. Like I'm not saying I
The poorer
condone
you
this.
are, the more you can like F around.
Yeah, exactly.
Is what you're
No,
saying.
genuinely.
Status thing, probably.
I'll be poor.
Purity is associated with some sort of status, probably.
Like
right?
it's about control and about property, right? So like in her book Virgin Nation, Sarah Masliner argues that you can trace modern purity culture to the South prior to the Civil War. So the South is like explicitly supposed to be Christian. There's all of these schisms we see over the question of abolitionism in major American Protestant denominations in the 1800s, right? So like the Southern Baptist Church was officially like formed to protect slavery. Like they schismed with the existing Baptist Church because they were like, oh, we need to enslave people. It's incredibly important to us.
Which is funny because most Black Baptists in the South are Southern Baptists.
It's wild to me.
Currently.
I'm like,
Yeah.
maybe there's a lot of denominations out there, and some of them were not founded on owning people, right? Like, just, I would shop around a little bit more. But there's this, Mosley makes this argument that if you are looking for a way to perform virtue and you own people, a lot of the, like, don't do violence and don't, like, own people and stuff from the Bible is gone. So, like, what do you base virtue around while also making sure that your white daughters are not having sex with
How do you maintain
Black
control?
men,
Yeah.
right? Because you don't want the children inheriting your plantation. Like, again, this is the same thing as Henry VIII. Like, we know that people like, Thomas Jefferson, like, was raping a Black woman and had children with them. But, like, we have to protect the purity,
While
the
also
racial
arguing
purity.
against slavery officially.
Yeah. Well, we have to protect the racial purity of white women, right? And so you develop this, like, cultural idea, this, like, oh, being a good woman, being a good Christian is protecting your body and being pure. And that racial purity element is very much there under the moral purity. And then this is, like, absolutely compressing 100 years of American history, but that kind of mutates and evolves. And we see that in, like, the muscular Christianity and the founding of the YMCA at the turn of the century. We see that in this kind of, like, family values, capitalism versus communism thing in the 1950s. And it all kind of comes to a head, I think, in the 70s and 80s.
So I understand the concept of interracial marriages were not legal. And so that kind of, if you can't have sex outside of marriage, then you can't have sex with a Black man, period, at all. How did that transition to you can't have sex outside of marriage with anyone? Like, where did that come from? How did it transition to white people too?
I mean, there's a little bit of, I don't think this is like a direct, I mean, I think it's just kind of like a theme, sort of a cloud of a theme surrounding this is kind of like you're getting at is there's a politics of respectability kind of like, the more status you want to show off, like the less you do this thing. And then that probably just kind of like creeps a little bit into like it being more of a all-encompassing thing. Like you're talking about, this all kind of like culminates in like the 70s and 80s, and there are more books being written, and then like in the 90s, like purity culture becomes more of the thing as we know it. And there's also a lot of, I think one of the things kind of cementing recent purity culture is the merchandise around it, like the money people are making off the idea of virginity.
It's lucrative.
It is, like there's
Because
lots
not
of,
only
It's
does
a cottage
sex sell, but
industry.
not sex also sells.
Well, it's like, it's so funny because you grow up hearing like, oh, the world thinks about sex all the time. No one is thinking about sex more than evangelical
It's
Christians.
like this podcast has been done on the other side of the spectrum more times than I
Pun
ever
intended.
than I can count. Like, it's talked about all the time.
Like the yoga pants thing. Everyone remember the yoga
Oh my
pants
god.
thing?
Yeah.
My wife doesn't wear yoga pants in public because then the men are going to be looking at her body, and
And then the
that's
whole
what is
like and then the whole bell bottom yoga pants thing started, where apparently those were okay, but not tied at your ankles.
it was the ankle the problem. We
Where
are
the
really
hell did
throwing
that
it back
come
to
from?
the Victorians.
Is it like a foot fetish thing?
I mean, like, so like the concept of biblical marriage, like biblical womanhood, is one of these things where like we reconstruct and then we like pretend it's always been that way, right? Like you want to erase any kind of distinction, difference, disagreement in the archive, so you can tell a story where your story has always been true, and you can be like, to be a faithful Christian has always meant this. Marriage has always looked like this. Like womanhood has always looked like that. I do think a really pivotal moment comes in the 1970s with the rise of the feminist movement. There's this fantastic show. It's on Hulu. In Canada, it's on Disney+. It's called Mrs. America. It stars Cate Blanchett. She's terrifying in it. And it's about this kind of battle between, on one side, the second wave feminist movement trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment in the States, and then Phyllis Schlafly, who was this woman. She was conservative Catholic, and she was an expert on nuclear policy, but she couldn't get people to take her seriously as a woman about nuclear policy. So she decided to basically build an empire super cynically on fighting the Equal Rights Amendment.
I'm so gay. That's so hot.
Oh, see, I think that Cate Blanchett is hot and evil in like Thor Ragnarok. The greatest, like most amazing thing about this show is that she is not hot in it. It's
incredible,
horrifying, but she's so good. Anyway, but like it becomes this movement that's built on a couple of things. One is like a kind of I think push for the right wing of the party, right, to get power. Right. You see this like shift from like the Nixon administration to Reagan being way more right wing. Right. But then the other thing is that segregation, the battle for segregation culturally is kind of lost, right? So like those Southern Baptists, all those Christian voters are voting like to keep segregation. Like Brown v. Board of Education and stuff comes in, and a lot of these Christian high schools and universities are founded so they can keep segregating. Bob Jones University did not allow interracial dating on campus until the year, I think it was 2000.
Well, when my parents got married, interracial marriage was still illegal in the state of Alabama. It wasn't enforced, but in 1989, their marriage technically was not legitimate.
And like, so there's this like very like, again, with the, like the Civil War, like you cannot talk about this without talking about the racist history of American evangelicalism. But there's this like, so Roe v. Wade happens, right? R.I.P. And there's this moment several years after. They won't tell you the story. They've changed the story to be like, we have always believed this. Prior to this point, evangelicals are pretty divided on questions of abortion and where life begins, right? Like there's an official issue of Christianity Today where they talk about like, actually, theologians have a lot of different things. And then there's a single phone call where they say, what's our wedge issue going to be? It can't be segregation anymore. We're losing that fight. And someone says, what about abortion? And someone says, okay. And then the Catholics, Phyllis Schlafly and stuff, they get in on it and they start like building this coalition to get power. And abortion becomes this thing. And if you're going to make abortion the moral like center of your political movement, then you need an apparatus that leads to the point where you don't want abortion.
That is the craziest collab ever.
Right?
I love
ever.
that one story just like proves the Adventist superstition of it's always the Catholics.
At least the Catholics were like ethically consistent in their like politics. The evangelicals were just like, well, whatever will get us the votes. And that's how you can elect Trump as a family values candidate. It's all about power.
And I think that like bodily control also shifted from the racial situation to the queer situation, because it's one of the things that I've noticed the most with coming out ministries and just gets under my skin the most is I don't necessarily have a problem laying this out on the podcast because I feel like he's laid it out himself multiple times. Michael Carducci's approach to his own story is this idea of when he was living the gay lifestyle, his biggest issue with that was that he was hoeing around, and just like the worry of HIV and other STDs and this like constant fear from the hoeing around, like that kind of stigma and shame shifted from the racial perspective to the queer perspective. And it's still being used because if you're not supposed to have sex outside of marriage, then queer people couldn't get married. You can't have sex with queer people. It solves so many issues for the conservatives.
I absolutely think you can't talk about this without talking about the AIDS epidemic.
There's a good book that hits on a lot of this. So we were talking about a little bit too of Jesus and John Wayne, which is phenomenal.
Kristen. I quote her in everything all the time. I'm obsessed with her. Keep going.
It's great. Which and I think it's interesting also to think about, okay, so we've had like this kind of, we've had like the ideal of American masculinity, which also kind of parallels a lot of this. Like they're, very
cowboy, individualistic, rugged, white,
right,
military.
Brokeback Mountain.
Very separate gender roles, very kind of defined. And so that kind of keeps tracking along throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And then at some point, purity culture, I think, takes some sort of a twist. And I think this is very recent. And just kind of playing with this idea, I wonder if it seems like it's on the decline. I don't know. Has anyone heard about it a lot recently, or maybe we're just in different circles than we grew up in, or I don't know.
Well, I was telling like Ari, it was weird like growing up in a purity culture world because I was always confronted with like people opposing it all the time, because since we grew up on the internet, like I was telling her when, you know, like Girl Defined is getting pushed onto me, I'm immediately able to watch a Cody Ko video that's like, this is stupid, and this is also a harmful message at the same
and
time.
Even still being made fun of with the TikTok sounds too.
Yeah, exactly. And when you had funny people like commenting on it, it kind of removed the power of purity culture. So even though I was dealing with it still like in my home life and at church and in my inner circle, like I was still being validated in my feelings.
Pushback.
Yeah, because I had the community of the internet.
And again, it goes back to
Interesting.
the isolation. Purity culture isolates, and having access
And then
to
gaslights.
Exactly. And then having access
always
to the
been,
different
right.
perspectives on the internet makes you feel like you're not the only one. And it helps you to be able to think more freely when you don't feel like you're just so special and you're thinking so weirdly.
And I think, like, so I was teasing you earlier, the pre-2010 thing, but like I'm 7,
We're just gonna
8
keep
years
circling
older.
back to that.
I'm the millennial here, and you all are Gen Z. And like one of the big differences is like I did not grow like I grew up with like early internet, but you guys grew up with like social media as like a huge component of your. Well, not you, because you grew up like Amish, basically, right?
Socially
But-
millennial.
But like I grew like in the 90s, you get this mainstreaming of purity culture, right? Like Bill Clinton is a Democrat president, and the True Love Waits movement like goes to Washington and like signs their purity pledges and puts them on the lawn, and he's like, this is great. Like the federal government is giving funding to abstinence only sex education, in part I think because of that AIDS epidemic and this anxiety around STIs and teen pregnancy and like social decline and drugs and all this stuff. And then you get like the Bush presidency happens and 9/11 happens, and that like Matt DeMay talks about that. Like that,
Also,
like,
can we talk about the irony that this happened during the Clinton administration?
I know Bill Clinton's like, don't have extramarital sex, don't do it, and we're like, okay.
The
But
dress is in the Smithsonian.
right.
Isn't that cool? I want to see it.
That's
That's it.
cool.
That's my whole
You're
comment.
right, like-
I just really want to see
I like this
I'm not
idea.
adding anything to the conversation other than I want to see Monica Lewinsky's dress.
But I mean, like, that's actually really interesting because that does go to the idea of like national record keeping and the ways that like
Yeah, and how it's always put on the woman.
oh yeah,
Like that.
poor Monica Lewinsky
she
for
was
so long.
She was 23 when that whole
He
thing
was the most
happened.
powerful person in the world.
Yeah.
and she
Our
was
age.
like
Yeah,
barely out of
she's-
university, and we blamed her.
And they crucified her.
And
It's
that
always
is-
the woman's fault.
That is so significant, bringing it back to Trump, because like evangelicals' whole thing was like Bill Clinton's a dirty dude and like he's bad and
majority.
family values, and then you bring in George Bush and we're all American, and like 9/11 happens and it's all about this, and it becomes this like era of cultural conservatism and family values. We were talking earlier about like the Disney Channel.
Yeah.
And
Like upholding the American family.
yeah, like Hillary Duff is wearing a purity ring. Britney Spears is talking about saving sex for marriage. The Jonas Brothers are all wearing purity rings. Like Justin Bieber's got a purity
Miley
ring.
Cyrus had her face.
Yeah, it's so
like-
weird. Like, why are kids on the Disney Channel having to be like, I'm not sexually active?
And like Haley Kiyoko being in the closet on the Disney Channel, and then
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the closet was clear.
it was a glass closet. Absolutely.
That girl was always gay.
But like, it's very much this moment where like it is totally normalized to talk about this. And then I think that like so much changed during the Obama presidency. There was so much activist work and so many things that changed just so quickly. Like the way that like American attitudes changed towards gay marriage between 2009 and 2015 is incredible. But like one of those things is we had this kind of new archive. Like we were talking in the first episode about personal stories and how like certain kinds of stories are legitimized. And I think that like the importance of record keeping is having more than one narrative of things, right? And it's what you said, like you had like girl defined videos, but you also had someone speaking back.
Right. Which is kind of an interesting like defining feature of this age, because it's also kind of what like let the purity movement out, though. Like it's what let it bleed into Adventism. Also was kind of like you said, maybe access to internet and like Adventists being a little more
The
comfortable.
ABC carried these books.
Yeah, really?
That's where my mom got
Really?
Dateable, was at the ABC.
Interesting. Okay. But I'm curious, like what like purity culture is looking like, and what it's going to look like in like the years following, at least the first, we hope, and only Trump presidency. It seems like the moral majority is kind of shaken up. Like, it can't really reckon with the fact that it's following it. It was, well, and is following a president, like, again, moral majority in quotes, that has done a lot of the things that it's warned against for so many years. So I don't know. Like, I'm curious to see what that continues to look like.
Especially with all of those, like, Disney Channel glass
Right.
closets shattering and all of those major figures.
Yeah. So that'll be interesting.
I feel like it is moving a step in the right direction. I'm able to like see it kind of. I have a younger brother and he's still in high school, and it's so interesting how like he navigates like these traditional things that are being that were put onto both of us, just like, but he has even more access to the internet than I did, and I had a crazy amount of access to the internet. So I feel like it is moving in the right direction where like teens are able to have more bodily autonomy and like control over themselves, and like be able to investigate for themselves and come to a conclusion themselves.
I think also kind of the goalposts have shifted. If we're talking about like how evangelicals use rhetoric to make power, right? Like, and you want to talk about like post-Trump, like I think that true love waits is over, and now it's all about critical race theory and gender ideology. Like a lot of that rhetoric that was used in the 80s and 90s that was all about anxieties around gender and gender roles and stuff around like mostly gay men has shifted to be about trans people. And
now it's like, are you one of those pronouns people?
pronoun people. I'm like, did no one pay attention in language arts in elementary school? Like, it's a part of speech. You used 4 of them in that sentence. Like, but I think that like, I would argue that one of the core like reasons why there's so much homophobia in the church and why there's so much transphobia now in the church is that the church, as a, you know, multi-thousand-year historical thing, has a vested interest in control and power and patriarchal control. And if people's gender is fluid or mutable or egalitarian, even like queerness calls into question that kind of passed down from God on high, never changing understanding of marriage and gender and sexuality. And that is so threatening if you believe that the like core tenet of Christianity is heteronormativity.
I don't even know if it has to do with queerness at all, really, because I think we mentioned those 6 Klopper verses in episode 1, and I mean I've done the work, I've broken them down, and the word homosexual did not even show up in the Bible until I want to say it was 1956.
I think it was the 40s.
40,
but it's
40, yeah, somewhere in there.
It's the 20th century.
When it was a strongly worded letter to the German Biblical Association as they were making a new translation of, you will put this word in here, otherwise all
and it
funding
was
is
funded.
cut.
Yeah,
exactly.
They put money to have like homophobia pushed, which is wicked.
Right.
Like,
So
that's crazy.
I don't even think it has to do with queerness at all. I think it's that matter of control. It's which group can we use to leverage to keep that
Who can we
control?
get the voters going?
Who are we going to take advantage of
common
to
enemy.
keep the money coming, keep the votes coming?
Also,
whatever
you want
we
to
need
talk
to do.
about translations? The King James Version was commissioned in part because King James had a boyfriend, and there was a lot of people who were mad about it, and so he was performing his righteousness by commissioning an official translation.
This might
and
be
that's
like-
the one all the conspiracy theorists are like, this is the one that's inspired. I'm like, oh, the national boyfriend atonement version.
I don't know. That's something that I definitely like struggle with the Bible as a whole. I'm not going to like denounce a whole religious holy book. Yeah, like the literal Bible. But it's
That's
like
going a
it's the
little too
most
far.
translated book, and it was used as a political leverage, like we just expressed. Like, how am I supposed, like, which translation is correct? I can't read Hebrew. I can't read Greek or
Trust me,
anything.
it doesn't help. I went to theology school, and it was so weird. Like, it was so wild taking all of these classes on how we got the canon. And there was one point even in my Ellen White class where he's going through the requirements for the canon, and the only one that Ellen White's books are missing is the long continued acceptance by the church. And so my question was, in 400 years, is Ellen White's writings going to be canon? And he hemmed and hawed all around it. But even the other books of the Bible that, like Enoch, that aren't canon, just because we decided that they weren't.
I think that really goes back though, like you're talking about like how do I know like who to listen to or what's right, right? And we were talking about like how history is not one single story. It's
Right.
a bunch of stuff that happened, and then we apply narratives to it. And I think that like there's this line that you hear again and again: the Bible is clear on this. The Bible is clear. But like the reason we have purity culture, the reason we have like books on how to do it and YouTube channels being like, here's how to layer your tank top with your little shrug or whatever, is because life happens outside of the things that are clear. Like it is messy. How do you like interpret a thousands-year-old book and a conversation between different writers from different perspectives and different, how do you take like a collection of like purity laws and poetry and narrative and letters and turn that into like swimsuit shopping? And like these texts belie their own claim, the Bible is clear, because they have to go and fill in the gap and then have a chapter being like, you can kiss but not with tongue, because like
I always thought that
Bible.
was so weird, like this invisible line that they made up. Like, again, I'm not going to name drop. I mean, if they listen to it, they listen to it. If the shoe fits, wear it. But one of the person that I got my sex ed from, like in high school, mentioned almost purity on like how close you can get to the line without stepping over it, and how both feet can be like across that line. And it was always weird because this teacher would always mention about like how much they could have been getting it, but they chose not to.
Weird flex, but okay.
Yeah, I know. I was like in class and I was like, slay queen. Like,
Good for you.
good for you. But it just like, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, it's bizarre.
I think Nadia Bolz-Weber has this beautiful concept in her book Shameless, where she talks about the distinction between purity and holiness, and how purity is about rules and about lines and about like these tests that no one can pass, and holiness is this really organic thing, like holiness punning on whole. Like holiness is collective action, holiness is childbirth, holiness is sexual union with someone who you like see the image of God in and love and take care of, all these things. And like the thing about holiness is that you cannot regulate it or legislate it or make it happen. It is something that is spontaneous and relational. And so because we cannot make rules around holiness, we make rules about purity, ideological purity, bodily purity, whatever instead, because the messiness and the uncontrollability of holiness, the uncontrollability about human bodies and stories scares us. So we retreat into boxes and rules and purity because like it makes us feel safe.
Did we just condense like 500 years of history into an hour? That was
It
incredible.
was reductive, but hey, it's a start.
So it is time to wrap it up. But the next one is going into where we go from here. So I think this was a really good foundation.
No
to figure out
pressure.
where we came from.
Solve purity culture in the next episode.
Yeah, all we had to do was tell you about history. You have to solve it.
Fill the vacuum. Sorry, now what?
You know, just
Thank you so much for
Yeah.
thanks chatting.
Thank you, you guys.